In southern Jordan, in the heart of the desert, lies an extraordinary ancient treasure, the splendid city of Petra. Built over 2,000 years ago by the Nabataeans, a people of ancient merchants no longer in existence, it holds innumerable architectural marvels, colossal monuments carved in the very cliffs, hundreds of tombs, and majestic temples.
The nature of Petra as a rock-carved city is really unique. There are not other places with this many tombs and this kind of architecture.
In this arid desert, Nabataean engineers built a system to collect the slightest water falling from the sky. They created an extensive catchment and storage network and made Petra an oasis in the middle of the desert, complete with lush gardens, a pool, and even a thermal spa.
You just didn't have water that was available during seasons. You had water available all year.
Even by modern-day standards, what the Nabataean engineers achieved is truly astounding. They transformed a mountainous desert zone into a prosperous and luxurious city that hosted over 20,000 people, the capital of the Nabataean kingdom.
What's fascinating about the culture of the Nabataeans is that in less than 2 centuries, they built an exceptional city. A blend of extreme luxury and exuberance that makes Petra so wonderful.
Thanks to the greatest experts on Petra and computer-generated images, you're about to get a behind-the-scenes look at how this ancient culture built monuments that defied the desert and understand how they stood the test of time. This is the story of how this majestic, ancient city was built, an architectural miracle brought to life by the genius of Nabataean stonemasons. To get to the lost city of Petra, one must travel 200 kilometers south from Amman, the Jordanian capital. Halfway between the Red Sea and the Dead Sea, Petra rises from the depths of a valley at the end of a narrow canyon. The city is an architectural wonder, unlike anything else on Earth. In all directions, colossal monuments catch the eye, most sculpted from the very rock itself. This marvelous gem of yesteryear was built over 2,000 years ago by a nomadic group of merchants, the Nabataeans. But what made these men decide to erect a city in this spot, in the middle of the desert?
During the first millennium, South Arabia and Yemen became the center for the production of frankincense and myrrh, 2 aromatics that were distributed. So they were distributed across the Mediterranean for this purpose, so that a trade route developed between Yemen and the Mediterranean world, and this came up through the western side of Arabia into Jordan with Petra as a center.
Petra was the perfect crossroads. It was a nexus of commerce. So you have north-south trade that involved frankincense and myrrh, and then turquoise and peridot and gemstones coming from the south. Then you have the east-west trade coming through, which is now Kuwait, that would have brought silk and Chinese goods in from the east. So there's no coincidence that Petra was the perfect location to build a city, and a city that would boom within hundreds of years to thousands of inhabitants.
Established in the middle of commercial trade routes, Petra's location also had other advantages. The steep hillsides surrounding the city represented an ideal bastion against pillagers or even potential invaders from neighboring kingdoms. Back in the days, the Nabataeans built control towers in the highest parts of the city as a way to ensure their security. To enter, visitors had no choice. They had to pass through this long pathway, a gorge formed by erosion, known as the Seek. Another advantage was that Petra was located at the junction of multiple rivers. Known as wadis, these desert valleys were an essential freshwater source to the inhabitants of a city of such magnitude.
You're in a desert, water is scarce, and what do you find is a large basin where water drains from a couple of directions. So the original inhabitants of Petra understood that where water converges is probably the most important thing to look for a desert city. It's not a coincidence. It's not an arbitrary location. It's the perfect location where you have water and then trade, commerce, a flat valley that would be ideal for a city center. Petra is the best location within 100 or 200 miles easily, if not 1,000 miles, to build a city.
In just 200 years, the Nabataeans built their empire's greatest city in this hidden place between the mountains. The Seek, which was the only point of access, led to a vast plain that featured the city center and was home to some 20 to 30,000 people in the 1st century AD. The center and its surrounding cliffsides sheltered over 3,000 monuments that displayed Petra's greatness. The massive city of 23 kilometers by 11 became the capital of the Nabataean kingdom. At the city's entrance, the Kazne, meaning treasury, is regarded as one of the most lavish landmarks built by these master architects. The facade of this imposing edifice is decorated with ornamentations that reveal the Nabataeans' Greek and Egyptian influences. On the first level, high columns are topped with capitals decorated with spirals and vegetation. On both sides were 2 characters leading horses, a likely representation of the sons of Zeus. Above the first level pediment is a tolos, a circular structure specific to the ancient Greeks, surrounded by relief sculptures and carvings now almost invisible after 2,000 years of erosion. At the very top, the monument is crowned with a massive funeral urn that's 3.5 meters high. Behind this lavish entryway lies a vast hall that opens onto 3 distinctive rooms, all of which are imposingly large. But unlike the exterior, the inside of the Kazne is decidedly plain. Its walls were left completely bare.
The function of the Kazne remains a puzzling question. And it has been speculated that it was a tomb for one of the Nabataean kings because it's one of the larger, more grandiose tombs that exist at Petra. There may be 10 or 15 of these tombs of that nature. The rest are pretty mundane. So the assumption is some king had to be buried here. And we postulate that maybe, possibly, it was a tomb for the great Nabataean king, Aratus IV. But this is only guesswork. We really don't know who was buried there. And there are no inscriptions at any of the tombs to give us some idea of who this tomb represents, so that it's only guesswork.
The monument was entirely carved out of a sandstone cliff some 80 meters high. In order to carry out such a task, the designers had to completely reinvent their usual building techniques, because it was impossible for workers to develop the structure using typical bottom-to-top methods.
Had they started from the bottom, it would have been impossible for them to know exactly where to begin so that the wall would be plumb, because the cliff sides are not always perpendicular. They can be slightly slanted. That's very difficult to calculate. There's another big problem that comes with constantly chipping away from above yourself, and that's namely the risk of debris falling on the workers below. Not to mention widespread worker fatigue from using such heavy tools. The workers would have gotten tired very quickly.
The Kazne was thus carved from the top to the bottom. but its sides are over 40 meters high. How did the workers reach such heights to even begin construction? The first thing that comes to mind is quite obviously scaffolding. But in this desert region, wood was a very rare commodity.
If we look at the pollen record in Petra, we notice that trees were not much more abundant than they are today. And the trees that did exist in the area are similar to trees we see today, juniper and oak. The climate hasn't changed enough to change the variety of trees. So trees did grow then, but they grew sparsely. They were not common at all. So the use of scaffolding would have been a very, very rare luxury for the Nabataeans to have.
With neither wood nor scaffolding, the architects and workers had to get creative with the resources that were available at the time. To this day, remnants from the lavish construction of the Kasne are visible on the mountainside. They reveal the incredible technical know-how of the 2,000-year-old Nabataean people.
When the Nabataeans decided to build the facade of the Kasne, they had to prepare the area so they could reach the mountaintop before even beginning construction. And then they sculpted it from the top down. To do that, they built a staircase, and they built it wide enough to allow the workers to comfortably go up and down, even while carrying their tools. There was a bridge over there that allowed them to get from the staircase to the front on the other side. They went around the back of the mountain in order to get to the summit, and then they carved out the top of the Kasne.
After climbing the first steps of this impressive staircase, one reaches a vast cave, a shelter carved out by the workers at the start of construction.
This cave was where the laborers who were assigned the construction of the Kasne stored the tools that they needed. They would meet here at the beginning of the day, then they would take the bridge to go around the mountain, and then they'd begin sculpting the rock. Building this cave was an enormous task in and of itself, but it was only preparation for the actual construction still to come.
Before the building of the monument even began, Nabataean workers had already accomplished something incredible. But once they managed to reach the top of the site, their task had only just begun. Here is the most probable method used by these ancient builders to carve the impressive Kasne straight out of the rock. First, they likely dug a horizontal tunnel in the cliffside to access the face of the future structure. Then, able to stand in the small space, the workers could have begun the meticulous carving of the rock into the shape of the funeral urn. Once the first level was completed, they dug 2 vertical trenches on either side of the future monument. Then another horizontal tunnel was dug out of the rock and shaped. A series of notches engraved into the rock were likely used as ladders so that workers could access the lower levels. They continued working meter after meter until they finally reached the bottom. At every step, workers had to be extremely precise. Once a level was completed, there was no way to come back to it later. The slightest error or miscalculation would have been carved into the rock for eternity. Facing the facade, one can still see the vertical trenches and enclaves to this day, the ultimate remnants of this gigantic construction site. According to experts, the completion of the Kasne took more than 5 years. 2 kilometers from here, another one of the city's buildings was also carved entirely out of the rock. It's called Ad-Dair. To reach it, one must follow a narrow path, then climb over 800 stone steps. At the end is this colossal monastery that towers over the city below. The facade of Ad-Dair is less ornate than that of the Kazne, but it also features imposing columns that support pediments on 2 levels. There, too, is a 10-meter-high funeral urn at the top of the structure.
During the Christian period, it was developed into a monastery. But in the earlier period, its purpose seems to have been originally a tomb. Who was buried there and when is a matter of speculation again. But it is one of the most magnificent tombs at Petra, along with the Kazne.
At first glance, the majestic Ad-Dair seems to have been built the same way as the Kazne. The entire monument is carved out of the rock. But upon closer inspection, one will notice the cliffs here are not as steep. Instead, there's a rock wall that gently slopes towards the ground. That means the workers had to adapt to this specific topography. Reaching the top of the construction site here was easy. One simply had to climb the slope. The carving of the urn was therefore a rather simple task. The rest of the construction took place in 2 stages. First, a kind of giant staircase was carved into the mountainside. The goal was to eliminate the excess rock so that a perfectly vertical facade could be built. Then, workers carved Ad-Dair little by little, from top to bottom, one step after another. To the untrained eye, the sculpture work seems almost crude. The columns and their capitals are rough, and the pediments are barely decorated. But behind the apparent simplicity lies a superior technical mastery.
Contrary to what most people think, it's easier to make a capital that's decorated with something like acanthus leaves or any ornate capital, because that gives you something to work around in case you make any mistakes while carving it out. You can always slightly change the shape of a leaf so that it hides your mistake and no one sees it. However, with clean, straight lines, the slightest error becomes visible. That means you have to be much more careful and rigorous in your work. In other words, there's absolutely no room for error.
These perfectly smooth columns and the refined lines indicate an exceptionally rare level of skill. What makes them even more remarkable is that they were all carved out of the mountain in one piece. If Ad-Dair had been made of stone blocks laid on top of one another, the carvers could have picked them individually before meticulously shaping them and assembling them. But none of that was possible here. The men worked up against the rocky wall for weeks, digging centimeter after centimeter. Every carving gesture had to be perfect. No blunder was tolerated.
If workers broke something by mistake, if the stone had a weak spot, or if any part of the cornice or capital broke off, well, that was it. It's not like you could just replace the piece in question. The slightest error was fatal to the entire project and was irreparable.
The sheer size of these monuments made their construction immensely difficult. The architects and workers were clearly experts in many fields in addition to construction. They also had a deep understanding of the local geology. The most striking example of this is the fault line tomb, built on Mount al-Mu'izra to the northwest of the city center. At first glance, this tomb resembles all the others. However, in its core are 2 clearly noticeable horizontal fault lines. To carve this tomb in this specific place, the sculptors had to integrate these fractures into the architectural design. The entryway was dug out until it reached the lower fault line. As for the columns, they were built as high as the second fault line. This funeral monument turns out to be slightly narrower than the other typical tombs of Nabataean architecture. But thanks to this ingenious strategy, despite being very deep, the cracks never jeopardized the tomb's durability.
That's what made the Nabataean process so incredible, in that it was so flexible that it allowed for variations in the design work as you carved deeper into the rock. Should you find joints or cracks, they were able to modify their design to accommodate these flaws within the rock material, but still produced a facade that was fantastic in design, but characteristic to the Nabataeans.
In total, the lost city of Petra contains over 2,700 monuments carved out of the rock, shaped by millions of years of erosion before being sculpted by human tools. The sandstone cliffs offer an extraordinary palette of colors.
The nature of Petra as a rock-carved city is really unique. There are not other places with this many tombs and this kind of architecture. From small little niches that were cut into the rock for worshiping their deities, to temples, to magnificent tombs and glamorous tombs, to very mundane tombs. The number of these rock-carved areas is unparalleled anywhere in the Mediterranean world. Petra is unique, exceptional in this regard.
But the lavish, rose-colored city was more than edifices carved into the rock. At its peak, the city also featured many stone structures built according to traditional construction methods. The sandstone used to build these giant monuments came from the neighboring construction sites. While carving out the cliff sides, workers also extracted large quantities of stone from the mountain. These stones were carefully shaped and then recycled. Many of these 2,000-year-old buildings have since been destroyed or buried in the sand. No one knows exactly how many stood here, but one thing is certain: the amount of stone extracted from the mountain could not have been enough for all of the structures in question. The builders must have also tapped into Petra's surrounding areas. Thanks to archaeological excavations, specialists have found a total of 14 stone quarries around the city. That's where workers extracted thousands of cubic meters of multicolored sandstone. 1 kilometer southeast of the city center, at the summit of Jebel al-Matba, lies one of the biggest stone quarries. Men toiled here for years on end, across dozens of meters on each side, to extract stone blocks each weighing hundreds of kilos. Their only tools were a pick, a mallet, and an iron wedge, nothing more. These 2 stone obelisks are the last remaining indicators of the rock's original height before it was extracted. In total, almost 7 meters of rock were dug out.
These columns left behind are signs and witness about the volume of the rock that were extracted from this particular quarry, which counts for at least tens of thousands of cubic meters. The Nabataeans had adapted their own way and style in rock excavation, and this is very clear within the site and the other quarrying that are distributed all over the area.
But the most impressive stone quarry is that of Wadi Asiag. First, men dug out the floor to extract about 30 meters of rock. But at this stage, they discovered sandstone of much higher quality. To exploit it, they dug directly into the bottom of the cliff and carved out a room that's over 8 meters long.
This kind of sand is quite hard, so it is more resistant than the others. It is characterized by its yellowish-brownish color, so there a huge amount of rocks were excavated from this quarry. It is estimated that the quantities of the rock which is extracted from this quarry alone more than 31,000 meter cube.
But once the blocks of sandstone were removed from the mountain, the men still had to transport them to the city center, which was sometimes hundreds of meters away. So how did they do it? No one knows for sure.
It's quite rare to find traces of how the rocks were transported. You have to keep in mind that these quarries have been exposed to the elements without an interruption for 2,000 years. So many of the stones have been significantly eroded. Any traces potentially left behind by rock movement have completely disappeared or have been covered up by later construction, debris, or even by soil. That's what 2,000 years will do. A lot has happened in the 2,000 years after the Nabataeans.
Nevertheless, local topography has inspired many different archaeological theories.
If the quarries were below the level of the city, we would worry and we would be confused as to how the rocks were moved. But what's good about Petra is that the quarries are all found above the valley. They're not at the lower portion of the valley. So the quarries where the rock was removed to use for construction in Petra are all found either at the same level or above. So simple roller tools could have been used to haul the rock down.
According to experts, Nabataean workers probably relied on simple wooden rails to transport the stone. Wooden logs were laid down on top of two parallel tree trunks. The stone blocks could then be rolled down the slope with relative ease. One of the most impressive monuments erected with these sandstone blocks pulled from the quarries is undoubtedly the Great Temple. This enormous building stretches over 7,500 square meters, and despite its name, it was likely not used as a temple, but rather as an important administrative building, or even as the public section of the royal palace. The vast entrance porch leads to a series of rooms and hallways surrounded by columns. Was this used as a courtroom or an assembly area? No one knows. Today, only ruins remain of this once majestic monument. But these massive stone blocks beg yet another question. How did the Nabataeans raise these stones 35 meters into the air without any scaffolding? The Nabataeans left no written history to enlighten us, but by looking at how the Romans and other ancient civilizations carried out similar tasks, experts have a few theories.
There are quite a few machines that were made out of wood, and that would make it possible to lift big stones like these. The most commonly used machines were what we call lifting jacks. The idea is to have two beams attached together using cables or shrouds, and then to raise the stone off a pulley. Using the swinging motion of the machine, they could get the stone closer to the wall.
One variation of the lifting jack is what we call a derrick. It only requires a single, large wooden beam. It is placed in a hole in the ground to maintain stability. At the other end, pulleys are connected to two cords attached to the ground, and a third cord tied around the rock. Using a pendulum-like movement, the rock can be lifted and then eventually positioned anywhere along the construction site.
Derricks are certainly more practical than lifting jacks. The latter can only move in one direction, and they don't turn. Using a derrick, it's easy to pick up a block on one side, turn it, and set it down on a structure. I personally think they use derricks.
Using these smart but rudimentary tools, in combination with their manpower, the Nabataean workers probably spent years building the Great Temple. Some estimate that all of Petra must have taken at least 200 years to build. But the Nabataeans had yet another hurdle to face when they decided to build their capital here. A 1,200-kilometer fault line marks the spot where two tectonic plates come into contact, the Arabian Plate and the Sana'i subplate. The seismic risk is extremely high along this fault line. In the past, the center of Petra fell victim to numerous earthquakes. Those were the reason why all the structures not built into the surrounding cliff sides crumbled through the years. All but one. Its name, Qasr al-Bint. In Bedouin Arabic, the name means the Pharaoh's daughter's palace, but it was probably also the city's largest place of worship.
The temple of Qasr al-Bint was one of 3 temples in the center of Petra. Construction of this temple began in the early 1st century BC and finished in the 1st century AD, during the time of King Aretas IV Philopatris. This temple was built for the purpose of honoring and worshiping the god Dushara, the most popular god of the Nabataean Arabs in Petra.
A temple as important as this one needed to be protected from the ravages of nature. Specialists believe the Nabataeans used highly ingenious techniques to make this structure one of the world's first earthquake-resistant buildings. During an earthquake, buildings with a complex structure are subjected to forces from every angle. Such forces almost inevitably cause the structures to collapse. The Temple of Qasr al-Bint is a perfect square. In an earthquake, pressure on the structure is exerted evenly across all 4 sides of the monument, dramatically reducing the overall impact. But to further protect their place of worship, the Nabataean builders also relied on another strategy, traces of which are still visible on the temple walls. These horizontal grooves are actually the remains of ancient wooden beams. While building the temple's load-bearing walls, the workers inserted cedar beams at various levels. Connected to one another, they formed long transoms all around the structure. Wood is much more flexible than stone. In the event of an earthquake, it absorbs part of the pressure.
Seismic waves propagate from bottom to top, but when they come into contact with wooden planks, they disperse horizontally. If the seismic wave continues to grow, then it hits the other wooden planks higher up. They also disperse the energy and ultimately minimize the impact on the upper part of the building. This technique has helped the temple to remain standing in spite of its size. It's the only monument built in this way, and the only one still standing despite the multitude of earthquakes that have struck this region.
These extraordinary construction techniques are surely why Qasr al-Bint is still standing today, almost entirely intact in the heart of the ancient city. In the arid regions of the Middle East, earthquakes were not the only natural threat to local inhabitants. The lack of water was also a crucial problem. Here, it only rains about 15 centimeters per year, and when the rain finally comes between December and March, it falls in abundance and can lead to dreadful flooding. The Nabataeans thus had to tackle two challenges simultaneously: stocking the rainfall, however little, so they could use it throughout the year, while also protecting the city from flash flooding. The walls of the Sikh, the long gorge that marks the entrance to Petra, harbor clues that reveal the way the ancient builders were able to control the water.
This carving channel came all the way from the entrance of the Sikh till the treasury facade, which is about 1,200 meters. And actually, if we get a close look to those carving channel, we can see that there's a kind of white mortar covering the edge and the face of those channels. And it's meant to be here to protect the water not going to the sediment rocks beneath it.
The Sikh was crisscrossed with channels within the cliff sides. On the opposite side, other kinds of traces are also visible. These are more sophisticated channels. Clay pipes were actually built into the cliffs. They were then assembled one by one using a waterproof coating. Perfectly thought out, their diameter allowed to maintain natural pressure within the pipes. This way, the water could naturally flow towards the city center unobstructed and even go up gentle slopes. A bit further north of the city, another site highlights the genius of the Nabataean builders. This was once the setting of water purification reservoirs.
If you look to the edge of the cliff, you can see a carving channel, which is mostly destroyed. The idea of this channel is to collect water from the top of the cliff and then firstly feed that big basin here, which we can call it as a collection basin. And the main using for this basin is to let silt settle down for a while. And in this case, they can be sure the water is getting somehow filtered and out of dirt. And after that, when they're sure that some of the water getting filtered and it's good, through a small valve in this wall between the two basins, the water go to this next small basin and kept for the next step, which is going again through this dam here and another small valve in the dam, and then through more cistern, water channels and pipes to feed the rest of many water cistern in this area.
By successively passing through multiple basins, the water would settle little by little, progressively ridding itself of impurities. The final reservoir contained clean drinking water, which would then pass into the city's main drinking water system. Over the years, the numerous archaeological excavations have revealed that Petra had a tremendously complex water system. The city was surrounded by dams, as well as a network of reservoirs for holding and purifying, in addition to long diversion canals that all helped avoid flooding while also storing precious rainwater. The city center was scattered with dozens of kilometers of canals. Water circulated along the cliff sides, passed through the streets via aqueducts, snaked over the walls, and fed into the city's numerous cisterns and reservoirs.
If we connect actually all the pipes together, we can reach something like 170 kilometers of pipes in one line. So this is give us an idea of how much work done to protect the site and the region.
Once they learned how to engineer that water for storage and build cisterns and storage facilities and reservoirs, suddenly you just didn't have water that was available during seasons. You had water available all year.
The skills of the Nabataeans with architecture and construction are very impressive when it comes to their hydrology. These skills are unparalleled. They had to be developed or you couldn't live in this kind of landscape.
Thanks to its quasi-perfect mastery of blue gold, Petra became a genuine desert oasis in just a few decades. In the city center, right next to the Great Temple, the Nabataeans even went as far as building an immense bathing complex that used thousands of liters of water. It came with its own garden, lush with numerous trees. And nearby was a basin as large as an Olympic-sized swimming pool. In the middle of it, on a small island, was a richly decorated pavilion. Today, nothing remains of this once impressive destination for royal leisure and relaxation. In fact, when archaeologists organized the first excavations here some 20 years ago, they never expected to find something so opulent.
Before the excavations, none of this was visible. These slopes appeared barren and undeveloped. But once we excavated, we found remnants of what was here. Excavations revealed an extremely complex system of pipes, hydraulic surfaces, and cisterns that were incredibly refined architecturally. Archaeologists quickly realized that they were dealing with a highly complex system that included an open-air pool, which had in the middle of it a large and extremely elegant pavilion. And below the pool, there was a garden, which was also very polished from an architectural standpoint. The representation element was clearly present. The entire system was supported by a series of cisterns and aqueducts that brought water from all over the valley.
But this facility, complete with pool and garden, was not the only aquatic area in Petra 2,000 years ago. A bit further away, at the top of Jebel Qubta, was an even more sophisticated site, a gigantic thermal spa. The entrance was through a wide courtyard. It opened onto a banquet room on one side and a frigidarium on the other. That room contained a pool of cold water designed to be the first stop of the visitors of the spa. The next step was the tepidarium, a warm water room. It served as a buffer between the cold water and the next step in the journey. Multiple hot rooms equipped with group basins that could accommodate between 2 to 3 people. The discovery of this thermal spa came as a surprise to archaeologists. No one expected to find such a complex facility on the barren plains overhanging the city center.
Petra is a place that's well known and very popular. But once you take an interest in the ruins, you realize that a lot of them are partially visible but unidentified. That's why the initial idea was to create a map of the area showing all the walls of which the top is more or less still visible. Then, based on that map, we wanted to interpret what Jebel Qubta looked like in the past. Imagine our surprise when that map revealed all the well-known characteristics of traditional thermal architecture. The excavation further revealed that despite its location on top of a massive cliff, there was really a thermal spa right where we stand.
In the area dedicated to the hot baths, the excavations revealed a clever heating system inspired by the Romans, called a hypocaust. A ventilated service room contained a hearth that was the main heat source. A small opening connected it to the floor of the room that needed heating. Hot air and smoke was funneled underneath the hot bath, within a subterranean chamber made of a stack of square bricks in which the heat could freely circulate. The walls also contained an entire network of clay water pipes, which were in turn connected to outlets on the roof of the building. This means the hot baths actually had heated floors and walls. Some estimate that temperatures could easily reach 30 degrees Celsius in these rooms. Other excavations conducted around the main site revealed numerous other remains. The extended architectural complex covered the entire plateau.
This is the aqueduct that fed into the baths and which was connected to an expansive rainwater retention network. It ran all across this valley and fed into the water tower of the spa. And on the other side, there was an interesting rock sanctuary that one could access via a staircase that used to be right here.
The suspended baths of Jebel Qubta were largely inspired by Greco-Roman thermal culture. But unlike their neighboring civilizations, the Nabataeans considered nudity and promiscuity to be unseemly and inappropriate. The presence of this small sanctuary proves that thermal practice here was likely connected to a ritual, not just a leisurely pastime. On this cliff, which towers over the city, the wealthiest of Petra's inhabitants could blend moments of relaxation and religion, all the while enjoying a breathtaking view of the entire capital. From the dryness of the desert to the bareness of the rock, to the steep cliff sides and the risk of earthquakes, Petra embodied just how the Nabataeans managed to turn around any and all of nature's obstacles. In less than 200 years, in the heart of inhospitable landscape, this wealthy and powerful people erected a luxurious and thriving city, a sumptuous capital that had no equal.
What's fascinating about studying the culture of the Nabataeans is seeing how, in just a few centuries, they managed to become incredibly wealthy. They wanted the best of the ancient world, which meant they imported artisans, architects, materials, and practices from the Greco-Roman world. Since the Nabataeans were able to get the cream of the crop and in record time, in less than 2 centuries, they built a city that was truly exceptional, combining the very best elements from Rome and Egypt to create their own luxurious and exuberant mix of the two.
In 106 AD, the capital of the Nabataean kingdom was annexed by the Roman Empire. Little by little, the structures were transformed, modified, or even destroyed by ancient Roman engineers. As the centuries passed, the city was slowly abandoned before falling into oblivion. It would only be rediscovered in the early 19th century by a Swiss explorer and adventurer. But ever since, Petra has been fascinating anyone who visits.
It's easy for us to think that people in our past were not as clever and knowledgeable as we are now. But when we look at the engineering expertise of the Nabataeans then, I really think we're looking at a society, a community of amazing engineering skills. They knew how to use the rock to their advantage for storage, for decoration. They knew how to use a landscape covered with a beautiful soil that would have been ideal for agriculture. And they knew that water was the key and the source to their livelihood.
We don't have any parallel for the Nabataeans and their architecture elsewhere, so it is fairly unique. Their engineering skill, their artistic skill, their architectural skill, all of these are very impressive.
2,000 years after its construction, Petra remains far from having revealed all of its secrets. To this day, archaeologists, historians, and geologists continue to study this unique architectural heritage. It is still an incomparable testament to the expertise of ancient builders.